All right, we're going to start off. So please, we'll start off with your name, the basics, where you're from, just small talk.
Okay.
Just give us an idea of who you are and where you're from.
Okay, so my name is Amanda Acker. I grew up in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, and I currently reside in Bridgeville, which is near the city of Pittsburgh, with my husband and my 2 kids. My son is going to be 16 and my daughter is 8.
Can you tell us maybe your occupation, what do you like to do, if you have any hobbies, stuff like that?
Yeah, so in my day job, I'm an office manager for a mental health outpatient practice. I help the therapists with, getting the clients scheduled and verifying insurances, a bunch of boring things. But it's also fun, and I enjoy getting to, help people get the help that they need in their times of need. I am a podcast host. I interview those who have been incarcerated. I interview addicts and people who suffer with mental illness to get their stories out there to inspire others across the world who may be in similar situations or, are on the verge of, not really knowing their direction in life, to hear stories of others, to know that, these are the things that they did to not do that, and also for people who have been through it to see that there is light on the other side and that they can overcome, and that, number one, we're not alone.
Let's start. Can you tell me a little bit more about your podcast? Like, what kind of stories? How long has it been going on for? Why did you start the podcast?
So I started the podcast to tell my own story of incarceration, addiction, and mental illness. And because I was always living in this state of shame and guilt. So I was in jail for about 8 months of my life about 13 years ago. And I was pregnant while I was incarcerated, and a bunch of trauma happened prior to that and after that. And I lived in this state of mind for over that 10-year, 12-year period of time where I couldn't speak my truth. I was afraid that I would be rejected, judged, you name it. I was telling myself stories in my head that I wasn't good enough, that I couldn't be anything because of my past. And I decided that, I started to break through those barriers that I put over myself, and I wanted to tell my story because I wanted others out there to know that it's okay to have a past and that we all make mistakes, but we don't have to live in that state of mind of shame and guilt, and we can move forward, and our past don't have to define our futures. And I have been doing this podcast since July of 2021, and I interview a plethora of people. I just am starting to hone in on my ideal guest, and that's why I stated earlier, it's someone who's been through something similar as me, to push the narrative that, even though we've been incarcerated, even though we've suffered from addiction or mental illness, that above all else, before anything else, that we're human. And in telling these other people's stories, it further solidifies that to my audience, so that they know that they're not alone and they can move forward with their lives no matter what they've been through.
Before we get into your story, maybe you could kind of paint us a picture of your childhood, your upbringing, kind of your background growing up.
Sure. So growing up, my life was, from the outside looking in, was typical. My mom and dad were married. I had an older sister. We lived in a middle-class neighborhood. And I was very close with my mother. Me and her were best friends. But in school, it was a little different. I didn't have friends in school. I was the outcast. I was weird. I was too smart. I was ugly. I got made fun of, but at the same time, I wouldn't consider myself someone who was bullied necessarily. I just kept to myself. I didn't have a social life. At home, I wasn't allowed to talk to boys on the phone, so that kept me from getting invited to things. I remember, just in particular, one story in middle school. I had a boyfriend, and I wasn't allowed to talk to him on the phone, so I would sneak and do all these things. But he would invited me over and my dad said no, and that ended that relationship. So I never felt good enough to do anything because I was being, I'm messing this all up.
Yeah, take your time. We have plenty of time.
So, sorry, let me start that over. Okay. All right, so growing up, my mother and I were very close. My father was distant. He was not abusive in any way. He just wasn't emotionally available, is how I like to explain it. So if something was going on in school, like I never went to him for anything. I always went to my mom. And it kind of, we created this very solid bond. And in school, though, I didn't have friends. I wasn't social. I was very quiet. I kept to myself, extremely shy. I always had this underlying thought that I wasn't good enough. And throughout, since I was so quiet and timid, I got made fun of. So I was told, I was weird, or I was ugly, or I was too smart because I excelled in school. And when I got to be about 15 years old, my sister was older than me, so she had left the house. And I remember being very upset about that because me and her were close too. We always played together, and, we just had a close sister relationship. So when she left, I felt abandoned by her, but at that age I didn't really realize that's what was happening. And when I came home from freshman year of high school, I come to find out that my parents had divorced and my mom had just left, and I was there with my dad. And I didn't know how to express myself at that age, and I remember just feeling this feeling of I don't deserve love. Like, why would she have left? Why did she do this to me? Why is this happening? I was put in the middle of their divorce, and looking back now, I don't think it was on purpose by either of my parents. It's just how it happened. And there's me and my dad tried his best to raise me from that point forward, but I still always felt this need to be accepted by others because I didn't see myself as good enough, so I was searching for that outside acceptance, and I started hanging out with the wrong crowd and rebelling against my dad, and I was starting to get into toxic relationships with men, and I saw it as, like, I'm so cool now, like I'm escaping all of this, I'm finally being accepted. And what happened is my mom told me at one point that the police were coming to take my dad, and I didn't tell him. Like, she told me, don't tell your dad, she basically wanted him to go to jail. It was a pretty ugly divorce. And so when the cops did come and I hadn't told him, I felt so guilty. And I remember coming downstairs and Dad was still there. They didn't take him because I was a minor, and the cops were like, okay, this isn't, he didn't do anything criminally wrong. He just didn't show up for a hearing. And so he stayed, and I told him, Dad, like, I knew. And he got very mad at me. He didn't embrace me. He didn't say, oh, it's okay, like, I know, like, you're going through a lot. And that wasn't the narrative he gave me. It was, why didn't you tell me? We're a team, Mandy. Why didn't you tell me? And from that point forward, there was no relationship between me and my dad. My mother fell victim to an abuser, so she kind of left me as well because she didn't want me to be, I didn't know this in the moment, but now I know that he threatened to hurt me, so she kept me away. So I was just alone, floating through life. This was around, I'd say I was about 17. And I just remember, I was just alone in this house. My dad started dating, and I just felt very abandoned. And that's what led to my life story after that point going forward.
Just something really quick. And let's get into it, about your life story. I mean, what are some moments that, I think led you to that? Can you remember any specific moments that really kind of like led you to that path? You said you were seeing toxic people with the wrong crowd. I mean, I don't know if you would like to kind of explain that and then maybe go into the story of your incarceration.
Yes. So from 17 until I got incarcerated, which was, I think I was 22, 23, like I said, my father had, moved on. He met a woman and they were dating and he wasn't around. So I thought, what am I going to do to get his attention, right? And so I ran away from home at age 18. Yes, I was 18, but I was still in school with an older man. And I remember calling my dad from a payphone. That's how long ago this was. And he said, I needed to come home. And so I did come home because that guy ended up being abusive. He, at the time, to be completely transparent, I was a virgin, and he was trying to force himself on me, and I didn't want that. So I needed to get out, and he wouldn't just take me home. So I literally, on foot, ran home. So I'm running home, and I get there, and my dad was like gone. He didn't, he no longer parented me. It was like you ran, basically, reading in between the lines, it was like you ran away, so now you figure out life. And so I went to college, and in college, the first semester of my college experience, I did okay, but I was always searching for a party because I didn't want to be alone, and I knew that if I drank, I could be social. So I was trying to find these parties, and I did find them, and I found all these other people, and they were doing other things. So it wasn't just drinking. We were doing pills and all these things. So the first time I do pills, I was taking Klonopins, and they made me feel like nothing mattered, and I finally felt okay. And I remember thinking, this is it. This is what I needed. This is the answer. Like, I no longer feel alone. I have this friend who's giving me these drugs, and we're hanging out, we're partying. And the first time I did them, I remember I wake up the next day, and I was with this guy, and he was like, hey, you want to go smoke a joint? And I was like, okay. And so we go outside, and I hit this joint. And I just remember the only thing I remember was the whole world had a rainbow on it. I remember going, wow. And I looked at him, and I just collapsed. And if it wasn't for this guy, I wouldn't be here right now telling this story because I would have died. He saved my life. And I remember calling my dad and telling him what had happened, and he literally didn't care. So this just keeps solidifying this narrative that I'm just not good enough, and I'm never going to get my dad's love or acceptance. And so I flunked out of college because in the second semester I just stopped going to class. I started cutting myself. I was very alone. I just felt like nobody gave a crap about me, so I stopped caring about me as well. And so I flunked out of college, which was my dream. College was a huge deal to me, and I wasted that opportunity. And when I come home, the house that I grew up in, my dad was no longer living there, and it was for sale. So I was waking up to strangers in my house, and I didn't have a phone, I didn't have cable, my dad shut everything off in the house. And so eventually I had to move out, and I met a guy who was much older than me at the time, and I moved in with him. And I remember I really wanted to go back to college, and so I called the college that I was going to, and they said the only way I can go back, because I was on academic probation, was that I could only take out loans. I was no longer eligible for grants. And so I had to, of course, call my dad, and he told me no. And that moment, when I'm even talking about it now, still makes me very upset because I didn't understand why he wouldn't help me. So I gave up. I move in with this older man, and I end up pregnant at 19. And when I first found out I was pregnant, I was like, well, I can't have this baby. I still have all of my life ahead of me, so I'm going to have an abortion. But I couldn't go through with the abortion. But I knew I couldn't stay with this man because he was abusive, sexually abusive. He would force me into a lot of things that I didn't want to do. And he just became very violent towards me in a sexual way. And while I was pregnant, I remember I got very, very ill. And he wouldn't take me to the emergency room. And he was very forceful and basically made me feel like I was making it up. And so I decided to give her up for adoption. And from there, I left him. I fled him. My mother was actually living in town at the time. We had reconciled at this point. She was away from her abuser, so I ran to her. And in doing that, my mother was like, well, you can stay here, but you can't stay here. It was kind of like I was there, but I wasn't really allowed to be in her place. So I ended up going to this amazing organization who I did my adoption through, which is Genesis, which is a local adoption agency here in Pittsburgh, and they had a house. So I lived there while I was pregnant with my daughter. And when I gave her up, I was very young, and I just remember that feeling of I loved this girl so much, and I couldn't keep her. And so I gave her to this beautiful family, but I felt even more empty after doing that. And then I met this man. Well, I knew this guy prior to this, and we started hanging out and dating, and he was there at the right place at the right time, essentially. And, I was having a moment. We were watching Monsters, Inc. It was us and a bunch of friends. And I couldn't take it because when the monster has to give the little girl back, it destroyed me. So I walked outside. I remember it was nighttime. I'm sitting on this front porch of this guy's house, and the guy who I ended up dating came out, and he swept me off my feet. He was like, "It's going to be okay. I'm here for you." And I believed that. I believed that he was there for me. And so I went with him, and we started dating, and I moved in with him, and he ended up being extremely abusive. And he would, tell me he was going to beat me so that no one would ever want me again because I wouldn't be pretty anymore. Fuck, I'm starting to cry. I'm sorry. So he said, he would cut my face and all these things. So I tried to leave him once, and I went back, and I ended up having my son. And I kept my son because I promised myself that I would never go through adoption again. I couldn't handle it. And so I had my son, but I was in this very abusive relationship, right? So I didn't know how to navigate things, and I just remember trying to keep him safe. And I got us a place, and because we were living with this person's dad, and I got us a place to live, and he destroyed it. He wouldn't pay for garbage pickup, so we had maggots in our house. We lived kind of out in the middle of nowhere. So one night he chases me around our house with an axe to my head and telling me that no one would hear me scream. And the fear I had, I didn't know what to do, right? I didn't know what to do, and I couldn't leave. I had nobody. He isolated me. I didn't talk to my mom anymore. I had no friends. And if people were around, I was too afraid to say what was actually occurring. And then one day when my son was about 6 months old, I had to take his dad to work, and I was talking to people on MySpace just because I needed a friend. And I ended up talking to a guy because I tend to gravitate towards men more than women. And it was just a friendship. It was nothing more. But he found all these messages. And he took our son into another room, and he put a knife to my throat and said that if I talked to this guy ever again, that he was going to kill me. And so that day was the last day of our relationship because I took him to work, and I called my mom, and she came to pick me up, and I went to a shelter, and I never went back to him. Thank God. And after that, it led to me just kind of trying to navigate life still. And I have this baby now, and I have to be a good mom. I have to be a good mom. And I kept trying to protect him, but I kept finding myself in relationships. So I went back to a different ex who was an alcoholic. And I thought, well, we can live with him and it'll be better. But it wasn't. This guy, I have my baby with me, and I have this alcoholic, so I'm now taking care of not just my son, but an alcoholic. And I ended up, becoming promiscuous. I was doing things that I know deep down were wrong. But I just wanted someone to love me and get me away from all the chaos that my life had become. Eventually, I did get my own place. I left him, and my friend at the time, we reconciled our friendship because through all my chaos, I kind of lost her as a friend, and she had her own chaos. And so we reconciled our friendship, and we ended up moving in together. And we ended up using cocaine. I became highly addicted to cocaine. And no one told me this But I know I was a really bad mom in these moments because all I cared about was getting high. I didn't care about anything else. I wouldn't pick him up for days upon days. I would leave him with his father that I knew wasn't good for him. And because I just wanted to numb my own pain. And so eventually, me and my friend went to a strip club. My sister was home and she was stripping at the time. And we go to this club because I wanted to support my sister, right? So we go there and I'm sitting at the bar. I remember I didn't have a job. I'm addicted to cocaine. I'm a wreck. I'm like 90 pounds soaking wet. I'm a mess and I'm at a strip club. So this very older man, old enough to probably be my father-ish older than me, and he's talking to me. He's going, Amanda, like I have this job for you. I'm a millionaire. I have this company. I'm gonna, I'll get you a computer. I'll get you a nice place. I'll pay the rent. And I believe him. And I said, okay, like this sounds awesome. Why wouldn't I? So we exchanged numbers, and eventually, me and him meet up, and he confesses to me, you know what? That's not what I meant. This is actually, I'm going to pay you to date me, but there won't be any sex. This is what he tells me. There's not going to be any sexual contact. It's just me taking you out. I'm going to shower you with gifts. I'm going to pay you. So I said, again, in my mind back then, well, why wouldn't I do this? This is easy money. So the next time I meet up with him, I have a boyfriend. He did not know what I was up to. I meet with this older man, and he took me to his apartment, and I said, hey, like, can you take me home? I'm ready to leave. And he said, well, after you come back here and lay down with me. And I was like, oh, crap. Like, I knew I was in a situation that I couldn't get out of. So I go to his bedroom, and I lay down on the bed with him, and we're just talking. But then it became more than talking, and my phone keeps going off. It's my boyfriend, because we're supposed to hang out. And this guy says to me, if your phone goes off one more time, I'm going to fucking kill you. So I was like, well, I guess I'm screwed now, and I have to do whatever this guy wants me to do. And I was scared. And he kept making me like do things orally. And I remember being like completely grossed out, and I really didn't want to. And he kept saying, well, this is what you wanted. This is what I told you we were going to do. You have to do this. Like, he was getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And I just wanted to go home so bad. Eventually, I don't remember how I got him to take me back to my car, but I did. And he takes me back, and he hands me money, but it's like not at all what we agreed to. So then my mind goes, oh, wait, I'm now a prostitute. I'm now selling myself for money. This is what this actually was. This is what he was originally propositioning me with, and I was too naive to see it, right? So then I go home, and I remember like being so grossed out about myself and what I had just done that I like scrubbed my teeth like I hadn't brushed my teeth in over 5 years. And I felt so disgusting. I tell my friend at the time what had happened, and she says, well, let's just go together. And if we go together, like, he can't hurt you, right? She says, well, I'll be there with you. And I believe her, because at the time I was like, we need the money. We needed to pay rent. We needed our drugs. So I go back. I put myself back in this situation. Same type of thing occurs, and now he has a box full of stripper clothes. And like, this is weird. Like, why would he have this? And, I refused to put anything on, and then he got very angry, and he was like, is this how you girls get your jollies off? Something ridiculous like that, and didn't pay us anything. So now it was far, so we drove all the way out there for literally nothing. And then her birthday comes around, and we're broke still, and I'm sitting there, and we wanted to do Coke, and if you don't know, Coke is expensive. And so I was like, well, you don't have money. And I remember being drunk and calling him. So I'm calling this person who sexually assaulted me and was prostituting me. And I'm calling him and I'm begging him. I was like, please, like, can you get us something? But this woman answered the phone, and she was very nasty to me. And she was like, you don't get to call him. He's mine. He gets me my drugs. Stop calling his phone, and all this chaos. And I didn't understand. So the next morning, my friend comes to me and she says to me, well, let's just rob this guy. And I remember thinking to myself, we're not actually going to do this, because we had ideas like this in the past and we never followed through on them, because we weren't those types of people. But drugs do crazy things to you. And so we involved 3 guys with us. And I remember driving out to this guy's house and just sweat just pouring over me. And I look at my friend and I say, we're going to jail. I can't do this. And she literally looks at me and says, F it, I'll just drive. And so I literally pull off the highway in a town that I knew, a town that I knew people that were there that I could run to. Instead of saying, okay, I'm leaving, if you want to go, go, but I'm not going, I get back in the car and I have her driving, because I didn't want to lose her, right? I'm still searching for this acceptance. I'm searching for that love. And I thought if I didn't follow through, I was going to lose everything somehow. So we end up at the guy's apartment, and all of this, it was chaotic. And I remember him looking at me, and he knew something was happening. And he says, Amanda, what is wrong with you? And I remember just like grabbing her phone out of her hand, because at the time we didn't all have phones, and grabbing her phone, I said, I have to go call and check on my son, because I couldn't be in this scenario. And I run downstairs to where the guys were, and I say, if you're going to do it, just go do it. And again, I don't flee. I don't call the cops. I go and run to my car, sweating. Sweat's just pouring off me. It's like summertime. It's really hot, too. And I lay down the back seat of my car and just hysterically crying. All of a sudden, everyone's ambushing me. Get in the driver's seat. What are you doing? And I'm like, oh, crap, And so I'm driving. We didn't get out of the parking lot. Mind you, growing up, I've never been in trouble. Never even got detention. And now I'm being pulled over at gunpoint and asked to slowly back out of my vehicle. Cops have their guns drawn. I remember I was shaking. And I'm like, and the only thought I could have in that moment was I was supposed to go pick up my son, and now I'm being arrested at gunpoint for robbing someone. They put me face down on the pavement. It's on this busy street in the city, and all these people are watching from the other side. I can feel them watching this go down. And I just remember, I have to get out of this. Like, what am I going to do? How am I going to get out of this? How do I get my son? And the cop said, eventually, I remember it was me and her in the cop car, and they had me in the front, and she's in the back, and she's telling me, don't say anything. Don't believe what they're telling you. Don't say anything. Don't say anything. And I'm like, I didn't say anything back to her, as they told me not to talk to anybody. And they said, if you tell us the truth, you won't go to jail. I believed them. Now looking back, I knew this was the wrong choice to make, but I told them everything. I left out the part as to why we robbed him and what he had done to me and what he was up to. I told him the whole story. I even wrote it down on paper, gave them a written statement, everything. And then we're in holding. I'm, going to jail. And I'm like, still very confused, but I thought, well, maybe I just have to go through the motions of this. So I get to the judge, and I'm not going home. I'm being hit with a $10,000 straight bond. I'm being charged with robbery, criminal conspiracy, and prostitution. And now everyone knows that I told the truth. Everyone has a copy of my written statement. I watch everyone else get bailed out of jail, and here I am, left. I call my dad, right back to him. And I say, Dad, please help me. I'm in jail. And he said, Mandy, you've made your bed. Now you need to lay in it, and hung up on me. And my mother didn't have money, so I did call her, but she told me, Amanda, there's nothing I can do right now. I ended up going up to Maine Population and County Jail. I was there for a week before I got bailed out. And I remember just being in there thinking, how did I get here? And how do I see my son? Why did I let this happen? I'm a horrible person. I don't deserve anything. And I remember while I was in there, though, to this day, I'll never forget this moment for that week that I was in. they have like churches come in to pray and do Bible studies. And so they prayed over me. And they said, God, please, show her that she's going to have good things, that she's going to see the world, and she's going to do great things. And I'll never forget that moment. So then eventually I get bailed out. And this is when my darkness really started. I mean, that was pretty bad, but it gets way worse because when you're out on bail, you don't know what your life's going to be. And it can take up to a year or more to get to sentencing. So I ended up getting out. I moved in with an ex of mine who helped my mom bail me out. I stayed there for a little bit, but I knew it wasn't going to work. And so I eventually end up moving in with an older man again. We weren't dating. He was just my friend. But I was dating this other guy. And we had no money. This is constant in my life, constantly looking for ways to make money. And I'm looking through the paper at one ads. And I lined up on stripping. And I was like, haha, maybe I should be a stripper. And he looks at me and goes, yeah, you should. Because that would be an easy way for us to make money. And you can do that. And I was like, okay. So I go to amateur night at this club. And it wasn't that bad in that moment. And I was like, okay, I can handle this. I got this. I won't drink. I'll do this sober so I don't end up in these situations where I'm inebriated and can't think straight. And for a little bit, that lasted until it didn't anymore. And now I'm drinking heavily to the point where I'm so drunk, I don't even know what I'm saying or doing anymore. And I stopped being able to separate clients from men who actually liked me, because here I am still searching for this acceptance and love. So I end up, going home with clients. I was starting to use cocaine again. I remember one situation where I went home with a man. When I got to his house, I'm not anti-gun or anything, but his house is just filled with guns. I mean, there's guns everywhere. And I remember going, oh man, I was scared, but he had drugs. So I'm there. And my son is just home with this guy I was dating. And here I am sleeping around and being promiscuous and doing drugs with men who I should have left at the club. And I end up meeting a man eventually who I thought was my saving grace. I was like, oh, this guy's it. He has a good job. He's really nice to me, and all the girls at the club would tell me I should date him. So I date this man. And then I find out shortly into our relationship that he is in his own criminal trouble that involved a minor. And I remember, thinking to myself, I got sick, and I was like, I'm going to puke because I don't know what's happening. And he became he never hit me, but he was very verbally violent. Like, he would yell at me. We would have these all-out fights. He would tell me, horrible things. And then we get to, all of this chaos is ensuing. I still don't know what's going to happen with my life. What's going to happen? Am I going to jail? Am I going to be convicted? Am I a felon? I had no idea. I'm stripping. I'm drinking all the time. I'm neglecting my own child still. And then we get down to sentencing time. And then right before that, I find out I'm pregnant to this man. And now I'm pregnant again, going to sentencing. And I got sentenced to, I watched my best friend, someone who I thought was my best friend, I watched her go to state prison 5 years. All the guys who were involved, state prison 5 years. And I'm like, now it's my turn. Luckily for me, not for them, the DA on our case saw that, I told the truth. I was, there's a word for it. I didn't give them any troubles. I always, if they asked a question, I answered honestly. And they told me that I had to go to county jail for 1 to 2 years with option for work release. I was convicted of criminal conspiracy to commit robbery with inflict of serious bodily injury because we had knives on us. And they were going to let me go home to figure things out with my son because they knew I had a minor. And so here I am, pregnant, going to jail. And, I remember walking out of there thinking, I just want to die. I can't go to jail. I can't handle it. I'm pregnant. I would rather die than go through with this and turn myself in. But then I remember thinking to myself, but if I die, I'm killing her too. And I couldn't do that. I could not kill my baby. So I did turn myself in. I spent 8 months in jail. Jail's horrible. It was, I remember, because for the work release option, you have to pass a drug test to get into the program. And I'm pregnant and I can't pee. So I have to go to county for at least 30 days. And everything is very slow in the criminal justice system. So I didn't know how long I was actually going to be there. So I end up in main population. And I remember being pregnant, I think, protected me, because it wasn't like I saw in the shows, right? It wasn't like there was all these fights breaking out, people weren't being raped in jail. It wasn't what I thought it was going to be. But I know that if I hadn't had my baby with me, that it could have been a lot worse, because I would have been quick to do things that maybe I wouldn't do because of the child I was carrying, like smuggling in tobacco and things I was propositioned to do, for real. I was propositioned to do that, but I said no. And then eventually I did get to go to work release. And while I'm incarcerated, everyone's like, oh, they love me because I was carrying this baby, and they would embrace me, they would give me extra food, all this stuff. But I knew I couldn't keep my daughter. I had nothing to offer this baby. So I went back to Genesis, and I found out, I asked if the family I had given my daughter up to when I was 19, if they were looking for another child, and I gave her to them. So my daughters are together with the same family. But it was like a few days after I gave her up for adoption that I got released. And now I'm released, and I'm just out there in the world. It's not like there was people there to take me somewhere. There was no, yay, you're released from jail. That didn't happen. I had to figure it out. And so I ended up in a 3-quarter house. But I had this period of time where I was homeless. I had nowhere to go. My mom told me I couldn't stay with her. I didn't speak to my dad. I had no friends. I was very much alone. And so I ended up eventually getting a bed at a 3-quarter house at this program. But after so long, I didn't want to stay there anymore. And I wanted to go back home. I wanted to leave. And then I ended up leaving, and this is the part I don't really want to talk about, so I don't really know how to end this.
It's fine. No, you can tell as much as you want. Because I think there are other questions that we can talk about that aren't of the particular story. But yeah, take your time, take a breath. Are you okay? Yeah?
Yeah, it was a lot. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, let me know if you need to take a breath. We can stop for a second. But yeah, we're close, and thank you so much for telling this story. And I think that I only have a handful of follow-up questions, really.
Okay.
And while you're catching your breath, I gotta check my list really quick, but
I kind of figured out how I can round it out too.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think I can just, because I don't want to go into the details of the relationship I entered into. So, but I do want to say how I lived in this shame bubble for over a decade, and how I ended up coming onto the other side of it.
Yeah, and then talk a little bit about that, and then after that we'll talk about the steps you took to kind of overcome that. So.
Okay. So after I get out of jail, I would love to say that was the end of my dark days and that I have this amazing life since then, but that wasn't the case. I still had a lot to learn. And now, not only am I an addict, I'm a felon as well. I'm a formerly incarcerated person, is what I like to say now. And so I hid that. I hid it. I ended up in other toxic relationships, not just with men, but with people at work. I was just, because I never saw myself as a person. I always saw myself as I had to be what everyone else wanted me to be. And so I would start to do drugs again. I'm drinking. I'm doing all the same behaviors that I was doing prior to incarceration, thinking that somehow it was going to be any different, and it wasn't. But now I'm hiding this fact about myself. I'm lying to employers. Well, not lying, I just wouldn't tell. They didn't ask, I didn't tell. So I would have jobs and go in, but this is the day I'm going to get fired. They're going to find out I have a criminal background. They're going to find out. And just going through this awful cycle of just not knowing what my life was going to be and living. I was so ashamed of myself and what I had done and the type of mother I had been. And in this process, I lost custody of my son, and I just lost everything, and I just couldn't see myself as good. I was bad. I was a criminal. I was a slut. I was this horrible, horrible mother. I never prioritized my son. I was doing all of these things and ending up in these relationships. And I finally break free from a very, very toxic relationship. Break free from that. But I'm still in this turmoil. And now I have all this other chaos that I've created on my own choices, because I made these choices out of that fear. But I still made the choices it's no one's fault that I got incarcerated. It's no one's fault that I chose to do drugs. That was my choice. And when I left this person, I remember feeling like, okay, now I'm going to wake up. Now I'll be free from all of this. But it was the same story, just kept repeating and repeating and repeating and repeating. Eventually I'm with my husband, my now husband, I'm married now. And I get a job, and I thought, this is the answer to all of my prayers. I'm making all this money. But it was toxic. I fell victim to the drinking, the partying side of it, the thinking that I could trust these people with my life, believing them over my husband, believing them over myself. And eventually I lose this job, and I just couldn't fight anymore. I was so betrayed. I felt even this dark hole kept consuming me, and I wanted to end my life. And this is about 3 years ago now, and I'm sitting in my closet and crying my eyes out, and I just give up. I don't think I can keep living this way. But in that moment, I had that realization but you need to figure out why this keeps happening. And that is when my breakthrough happened, and that's what got me to where I am today.
Let's talk about that breakthrough. What was there a particular moment? And I know that you did kind of mention while in jail, you noticed some people and things they said to you. You said the church came and spoke to you, and what were some things? What led you up to this moment of clarity and this new chapter in your life? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I've always, that point in when I was arrested that I talked about when they prayed with me and things like that, that thought was always in the back of my mind. And I think because I don't remember what my exact thoughts were when I wanted to kill myself, but I remember feeling a warmth, and that thought came to me. It's but they said that God is here and He wants good things for you, and you need to figure out how to get there and look at yourself. Do you love yourself, Amanda? And the answer was certainly no. Do I accept myself? No. Do I forgive myself? No. Why don't you figure out that? Because you know that deep down that there's something inside of you that you've been hiding, because you keep trying to, I always call myself a chameleon, right? I would just fit into the mold of whatever people wanted me to be, ignoring my own boundaries, my own values, to appease everyone else around me. The lying, the the drug use to numb the pain, and just all of these things that I was doing. And, about what led me to that was just in that moment, like it was almost like, I don't want to call it a spiritual awakening, but that's what it was. I felt a warmth, and something spoke to me and said, no, you can't end your life. That's caving in. That's allowing all of these things that have happened to you, and the people who want you, like, I don't know, in my mind, I always think people are rooting for me to fail, right? So you'd be proving them all right if you end your life. And I knew in that moment that I had to figure out who I am so that I can have those good things that I know that my higher power has for me. Whether that's God, the universe, whatever you want to call it, that's what spoke to me in that moment. That was that light bulb moment. And, from there it was deciding to be open and honest about who I am, period. Not worrying about if Joe is going to like me, if Sally is going to like me. Figuring out who I am so that I can be the best version of me on any given day, so that my family, my kids, everyone around me can experience me at that level, because I have boundaries now. I know what my values are, and I ask for help. And I know asking for help is very hard to do. But if I wouldn't have asked for help in that moment, I would not be here. And I asked my husband for help, even though I had hurt him in this process, and I know I have hurt him in this process. And even in this moment, he's worried about me. I put our marriage through the ringer year 1 and year 2. And, I was doing all these horrible things, but I knew that I needed to accept his love. And so I asked him for help, and I started to tell him things that I hadn't told him before, opening up to him and being honest and real about what I was feeling. And in that moment of asking him for help is when that change started to happen. So I'm okay, like here I am by myself, realizing that I need help, but now I have this ally who's there to help me along. And I started to think about who I am as a person outside of my past, like before all the labels, before the fact that, I'm a convicted felon, I'm an addict, I have mental illness, I have OCD and depression and anxiety. Before all that, who am I as a human being? And I never did that work before. And it's an ongoing process, and I have bad days still. But it's knowing, okay, like if I have this boundary and Sally over here is saying, hey, Amanda, do you want to go rob this person? I know now, absolutely not. I'm not doing that. But back then, I would have caved into that out of fear that she wouldn't like me. It was figuring out who I am as a person that really led me to overcome and be who I am today.
Wow. That's incredible. You mentioned something about your employment now and like what you do now. You have a podcast, and it seems like you're helping others who might be in a similar situation. Can you speak to that a little bit about how you said you worked at like a mental health rehab facility, and you also have this, sounds like a really interesting podcast about former incarcerated people. And I don't know, is there anything else? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that and how your negative experiences, how you're trying to change the world now and help others who are like going through the same thing.
Yes. So, as I said throughout my story, I would hide my criminal past. I would not tell employers. But when I lost that last job, I like to call that my former life, because when I talk about it now, I seriously feel like I'm telling somebody else's story. But I started to tell it. I started to not hide it. And I can remember as I had to find another job, and I had worked in the accounting field before. So I go to this accounting firm, and I'm sitting in this office. They put me in this tiny office to fill this application out. And there's that question in black and white. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? I'm like, well, shit, guess I can't get this job. And old me would have gotten up and ran away from it. But I sat there and I thought about it. I filled out the rest and came back to this question, and I checked yes, and I wrote it all out. and I'm sweating. I'm sick. I'm like, oh, great, this is so embarrassing. But they still did the interview, and I remember sitting in there, I'm going, okay, they're going to get to this question, and I was scared. I'm sweating and shaking. I'm in a room with men, a man who was the age of the guy who assaulted me, and all the men were around that age. And then they asked, well, tell me the story. What happened? And I told them the story, and they still offered me the job. No, I didn't end up taking that job for various reasons, but in that moment of doing that, I realized, oh, wow, like not everyone is going to judge me based on this. I still can have opportunities. And so any other employer, like the one that I have now, I remember, mental health, I'm like, old me wouldn't even have applied. And I was like, no, there was something in my gut, my intuition was telling me, this is the job you need to take. This is the job that's going to open things up for you. And so I applied, and it took a long time to get to the actual interview. And I told her, I was honest. And I said, would you be willing to hear my story and then make a decision? And she said yes. So I told her my story, and I've been there for 2 years now. And, in doing that, it showed me again, it solidified, this doesn't define me. Having this big F that I think I wear on my shirt that everyone can see doesn't define me. Having addiction in my past doesn't define me for who I am today. And there are people out there who look at me in a way that is negative, but there are so many people that will embrace me despite it. So I just kept going. And, I worked there for a while. About a year and a half so in is when I started telling my story publicly. But this job, like I get to help other people who are going through their darkest times get care and assistance, and making sure, and just making sure that the world is a better place. And that's my whole thing here. So then I started this podcast because I thought, because in the moment I was doing business management work online, and I was still ashamed. I was still in shame, but I was coming out of the shame through these experiences. And I remember I'd be sitting in these Zoom rooms with all these other women that were also certified online business managers, and I never fit in. I felt like, I felt like they were, they had these perfect lives, and here I am, and I have this criminal record, and what if I get found out? They're all going to judge me. But I got to this point where I literally couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't stand hiding. I said, if I don't tell this story to the world, I'm going to just combust, because I can't lie anymore. I can't hide it. And so I went to a trusted person in the online space, and I told him my story. And that's what catapulted me into doing it, because he said, Amanda, you could inspire people with this story. You could change lives by telling this. He goes, and it's not as bad as you think. He's like, people are going to relate to you. And so I said, okay, how do I do it? And we landed on this podcast idea. And so I said, okay, I'm going to start this podcast. But at first I wasn't going to share my story still. I was going to share other people's stories. But then I decided, you know what? I'm going to share mine too. And so there's a whole series on my podcast that dives deep into a lot of these different facets of my life story. And I was embraced. I haven't had one negative comment. People would say, wow, you inspired me to keep going, Amanda. I get messages all the time like, oh my gosh, I listened to this, or I heard you speaking on somebody else's podcast about your story, and now I don't feel so alone. Thank you. Thank you for opening up, and telling the world this. And that is what I'm doing, because I want people to know without a doubt that before you're anything, all these labels that society puts on us, that we put on ourselves, the barriers we build around us to make us live in this shame and keep repeating and repeating and repeating the same cycles, you don't have to do that. And you can do amazing things despite it, because before all of that, you are a human being and you deserve love. You deserve acceptance. You deserve to have a voice. I don't care what you've been through. Your voice matters, and you deserve those good things in your life. And that is why my podcast is called the Let Good Things In Show. And that is where the name stems from. And I interview people from all walks of life. I've interviewed, now I'm more focused on formerly incarcerated addicts and people with mental illness, but even prior to that, I've interviewed people who have been through foster care, and there's stories, I mean, they're horrific, but these women and men who I interview have overcome it. And they're sharing these stories openly with the world to also inspire. And that makes me so happy. And I love sharing these stories. And I love having these open and candid and raw conversations with other people, because it helps others see that they're not alone. And that's all I wanted in life. Through all of those experiences, I just didn't want to be alone. And I always felt like I was in this dark corner all by myself. And now that I know I'm not, wow. It changes everything. It changes my perspective on the human race as a whole. And it helps me to see that I'm not struggling alone, that we're all in this together. And that if we would just see each other as human beings, this world would be a much beautifuler place to live in. And we can coexist. We can have differing opinions. We can have open discussions about things and still come together for the greater good. And that is why I do what I do.
It's first off, I'll say you're one of the best people I like interviewing, because you're just a very incredible explainer of things and very motivational. I mean, you know, now I'm going to go look up your podcast. And,
Thank you.
And before you leave, actually, you should have Joe, who this is his studio here. He has like a really nice podcast studio in the back.
We saw it.
You
It's
did?
awesome.
Okay,
yeah.
Great, yeah. I think we're wrapping up here. You know, I don't really have that many follow-up questions. I mean, I guess for posterity, maybe you just say your situation now, you're married, your kid's about to turn 16.
Yeah.
Maybe just kind of just tell us little life notes now. What's life like now?
Yeah. So life now, it's not perfect. I still suffer from negative thoughts. I still have to be mindful of how I'm speaking to myself. I see a therapist. I'm very open and honest with my husband. I don't hide things anymore. And life is, it's as good as it can be. I remember when I first started on this journey, we were living in an apartment. And the landlord, when I first got the place, I wasn't with my husband yet. I got it on my own. And I remember signing my lease in this house. It was across the street from the building. I remember thinking, wow, this house is beautiful. And I thought to myself, one day this will be my house. And now we live in that house. We made that happen through, just persevering and keep going and keep moving forward and not looking back anymore. That stuff happened. It's there. It'll always be there. It's always going to be a part of me and make me who I am today, but it doesn't define my present, and it doesn't have to define my future either. And, my kids are happy. My son, he's going to be 16. I can't believe it. But I'm able to provide them with a safe home. It's calm. I'm not using drugs. I don't drink. I haven't had a drink in about 3 years now. I haven't smoked weed. That's a little bit. I was on medical marijuana, but I also stopped doing that. Today is day 7? Yeah, day 7. Haven't touched that. I haven't done pills in ages. That's been a long time. And I'm just living this clean life with my husband, and we have this amazing relationship. And, even when I know I repeat myself a lot to him about certain things, but he embraces me and he loves me for who I am, and I can accept his love now because I've let go of all that feeling of I'm not good enough. And I have days where I look at him and go, I don't even know why this man loves me, because I can be very neurotic, right? But I know no matter what, he's there for me, and we have an amazing relationship. I've been working the same job for over 2 years. I have this podcast. I speak my story from a raw standpoint. I'm candid. I open up about things because that's what I want to do. I want to inspire. A huge dream of mine now is I want to be a keynote speaker. I want to go to colleges and universities and share my story to let them, because my whole thing too is I want to help people who may not have been through it yet, to see that don't do these things, to stand in their own, to have their own values and boundaries, and that we can't allow others to influence us to the point where we forget who we are. Because that's what I did. And I lived this life of complete and utter chaos, and I don't wish that on anyone, not even my worst enemy. And it's just keep pushing forward and dreaming my dreams as big as I can dream them, so that, everything that happens, like being here today and being on camera, this is the first time for me doing something like this, and it means everything to me because it's my dream to speak this to the masses. And my life now is just incredible, and I don't have slews of friends knocking on my door to hang out, but guess what? I have a safe home to go home to every single day. I have a safe place to have my children and play with them. We have a yard. I mean, goodness, I have a car that isn't going to break down tomorrow, right? Oh gosh, now that I said that, it might. But, I have good things in my life because I chose to no longer hide who I am and to no longer live in shame and guilt.
It's incredible. Well, Amanda, thank you so much. Is there anything else that this is the kind of the final time I'd like to, of course, you've been incredible. You've said so much, and I really don't have any other questions for you. That was perfect, but I don't know. This is we're wrapping up now, but yeah, if there's anything else you'd like to say, maybe it's to others that are going through the same thing, other women, just other folks, what would you say to them? And maybe you just look in the camera and just address them. Like, what would you say?
I would tell them that, I say this a lot, but it's so important to hear that you're stronger than you think. And I promise you, no matter what you've been through in your life, you can have good things and you deserve them. And that you're good enough, you're loved, and that if nothing else, I'm rooting for you. And I know that you can do amazing things in the world despite whatever your own voice is telling you and what the outside world is telling you, because you're worth it.
Man, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And then this is just a technical thing, but like 10 seconds of silence so I can sample the... And you actually, while we do that, could you look straight to the camera? Just kind of like a video portrait. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah.